This is the Mindful Crinks, and I am your host, Ron Purser. I'm really excited about the conversation I had with Tara Isabella Burton, who is a novelist, essayist, and scholar of religion and spirituality. And we spoke about her new book, Self-Made, Creating Our Identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians, published by Public Affairs. Tara takes us on a historical tour of the evolution of self-making. That is, how our notions of individuality and self-identity formed in response to dramatic social and economic upheavals. Our conversation begins with the Renaissance, and we cover a lot of historical ground from the aristocratic strands of self-creation during the European Enlightenment, all the way to our current selfie-obsessed and social media influencer culture. Her book is really jam-packed with novel insights and revelations that trace this inward turn to our search for authenticity and how we've come to relocate the source of divinity in our own egoic desires, where our own desires become the source and arbiter of truth and reality. It really is a far-reaching conversation about the crisis of reality in Western culture, and the prognosis is, honestly, not good. Tara received a doctorate in theology from Trinity College, Oxford, where she was a Clarendon Scholar in 2017. Her first nonfiction book was Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, also published by Public Affairs. She really is quite prolific. She's published many essays in such outlets as the New York Times, The Atlantic, Current Affairs, Literary Hub, Vox, The Plow, and many more. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Welcome, Tara, to the Mindful Cranks. I'm really jazzed up. I just devoured your book. It's all highlighted. It's just a crazy good book. Just really excited to talk to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, so Tara Isabella Burton, she's the author of the new book, Self-Made, Creating Our Identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians, published by Public Affairs. And I think what's really remarkable is just this incredible how you've taken the reader on this historical tour, like the evolution of self-made consciousness, going back to the Renaissance, and you covered Nietzsche and Frederick Douglass, the New Thought movement, and the Gilded Age, and much more, all the way up into our social media influencer culture. And I think what's really shocking for me was your assertion that we have as a culture progressively over time kind of relocated the site or the location of the divine in ourselves. Not, and I think we'll talk a lot more about this, but not in a sense that the kingdom of God is within, but more that the kingdom of God is now our egoic desires, our self-desires. I mean, that was just a profound, earth-shattering sort of assertion in your book.
I mean, I joke sometimes. So I'm a theologian by training, and sometimes I think that I think everything's about theology. You know, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But in this case, I do think that this book, which is an intellectual and cultural history of the idea of self-creation, is also a story about theology. It's the story of a transition from, roughly speaking, in the early modern and modern West, from a world understood as God-ordered with an external purpose to one where the engine of purpose is our own human desire and choices. And I think that there's a misconception often that we are in a secular world or a non-religious world or a disenchanted world. And I do want to push back on that notion in this book. I think what we're seeing is not a kind of disenchanted world, but as you identify, a relocation of where that enchantment is, what the thing that makes the universe run. And I think we move from, and we see this in all over the book, particularly the 19th century, how as this God-ordered pre-Enlightenment world, particularly Christian worldview, recedes in the modern West, what takes its place are these ideas of energy or vibes or currents that the individual, by looking inwards, by focusing on their psychological affective states, can somehow harness. We see a version of this in the New Thought movement in the 19th century. This idea, a kind of precursor to modern movements like The Secret, the law of attraction, or manifesting, that if you think positive about becoming wealthy or healthy, you can kind of make the universe give you those qualities. We see it in Europe in the kind of rise of fin de siècle occultism and dandy celebrity culture in Paris. Figures like Sar Pelodan and Aleister Crowley, for whom the human will is this kind of source of magic. And in another podcast I was on recently, I described the relationship of desire in our kind of contemporary cultural context as analogous to like what we might have in a more explicitly Christian world thought of as the soul, that part of us that makes us really us, that thing that is the us thing, what makes us who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
okay.
yeah, that's really fascinating. And I am a Buddhist, and so when I, it was just quite a shock almost to see that being a Buddhist, it's completely opposite or orthogonal to the whole project of Buddhism, which is really that the second noble truth, that the source of suffering is desire, and the notion that we're an independent self, separate from all entities. This idea of that in self-made, it's all about firming up our identity, bolstering our identity. Uh, and that was just incredible. And so, but one thing I'd like to ask you, and I think you point this out, is that you aren't really strictly against self-creation either, given that it had liberatory effects such as the European Enlightenment and the break from the Catholic Church and gave us liberal democracy, right?
Yes, I am indeed in favor of liberal democracy. Getting that on the record. So I joke. I joke about this a lot. Like I'm an Episcopalian. I'm moderate by inclination, and while I think it's certainly possible to tell either like an exciting progressive story of self-making where we all got like free of the Catholic Church and superstition and repression and all can create our own selves, or you can sort of have the conservative tragic decline version of the story where in the good old days, the medieval era, everyone knew their place and men were men and women were women and kings were kings and peasants were peasants. And I don't think either of those stories is true. I think what we have seen in the self-making tradition at its best is a sense that regardless of how and where we were born, into what circumstances, each of us has the capacity, the opportunity, the dignity to transform our lives for the better, to make within and of our lives certain kinds of security, certain kinds of stability, and to an extent certain kinds of prosperity by virtue of the choices that we make. And that's, like, roughly speaking, a good thing.
Yeah.
Where it goes too far, in my estimation, or where I'm wary, is when we move from this idea that our capacities and our creative powers provide us with this opportunities, to the idea that there are certain people, special people, either because of an innate God-given talent or because of our own drive for hard work, or some kind of Frankenstein's monster fusion of the two ideas, which is where I think we are today, that there's a sort of special class of self-makers to be contrasted with the sheeple, the crowd, the masses who don't do this. I think there's a misconception that the gospel of self-making is a universally liberatory one, but as often as not, both in the European tradition and in the American tradition, you find the image of the self-maker as a convenient way of separating the aristocrats of the spirit or the hard workers from people who are looked upon as lesser because they are not remaking their lives sufficiently, and often as political justification, particularly in the American model, for not expanding, say, social services to the poor on the grounds that, well, they should have just worked harder.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You cover that really well in various chapters. And Maybe it might be worth digging in just a little bit on some of these really highlighted figures. And I never knew about this unusual German artist. I mean, I knew about what was going on in the Renaissance with artists starting to sign their paintings and everything. But this Albrecht Dürer, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his
Durer,
name
yeah,
correct.
Durer,
Yeah,
yeah.
why was he? I mean, he was a really significant figure in this Renaissance history, right?
Absolutely. So, yes, the subtitle of the book, Self-Made, is From Da Vinci to the Kardashians. But a more accurate, if less saleable title might have been Albrecht Dürer to the
Yeah.
Kardashians. Da Vinci gets the name recognition, but Dürer, who was painting roughly around the same time in Nuremberg, another sort of urban center of Renaissance life in Germany, or was now Germany, is basically one of the first self-portraitists in Western art history. Certainly the first, to my first person to really center his own self in the way that he did. Traditionally, you might have at most an artist depicting himself, for example, in a religious scene as a worshiper at the side of Christ,
Mhm.
watching the action. What Dürer does in his self-portraits, of which there are many, the most famous, the one painted in 1501, is sort of depict himself in postures that recall the postures in which Jesus would be traditionally posed. Face
Yeah.
forward, hands up in a certain way, meticulously. His curls. He's very famous for having very beautiful hair. Durer, like all of the contemporary sources talk about how much time he spent on his beautiful curls, and he sort of uses delicate gold work to create every curl so that you see the shine. And he
Wow.
also does something else, which is that he signs this. He signs AD, which is also there's sort of a tie-in, a little bit of religious reference with Anno Domini. But he suggests with his work that he is a kind of god, that his artistic genius is a kind of divine power that gives him certain privileges. He's also, for what it is worth, a canny progenitor of the personal brand. As a printmaker, he sort of pioneers these processes that mean it's not just that he creates work; he basically has intellectual property that gets mass produced. His ability to kind of create a personal brand is not just in these individual artistic works that are not reproducible, but in this kind of Dürer empire where his genius is the thing that is being reproduced over and over again through his prints. And so the sort of combination of his ability to harness this new technology of early mechanical reproduction, so to speak, combined with his ability to create the personal brand of himself as artist, means that we can really think about him as one of the modern world's first celebrities or artist celebrities. And he
Uh,
pioneers this godlike vision of himself.
like the first Renaissance selfie. Yeah.
Absolutely. He people say he invented the selfie, and I think that's absolutely fair. Because it's not just about self-depiction. It's about the aggrandizement, the idea that I, artist, and I, subject, am worthy of consideration in this way. That I am a god both as artist and as subject depicted, because my own self is just that special. And he's basically a middle class artisan son, but in depicting himself in furs associated with the nobility and the aristocracy, he's kind of leapfrogging the social order.
On the one hand, it seems like the Renaissance view was that people were not necessarily lucky, but due to good fortune or fate, that they were one of the elite few that had this innate divine gift. Is that how it was seen, or how did people explain this? And was this notion of genius a way to account for the vast changes that were occurring in 15th century?
I think so. Certainly. I think that the category of genius, while perhaps certainly true of a Da Vinci, to be sure, was also a way of trying to account for and create a narrative around wider increased social mobility. In the Renaissance in urban areas like Florence or Durer's own Nuremberg. Increasingly, more and more people in what you might consider the trades, artisans, merchants were acquiring wealth that was not inherited wealth, that was not through the sort of traditional title, feudal land system. And so simultaneously, you have this sort of wider phenomenon of people of social mobility and people transcending the traditional pre-modern social order, at the same time as you have these individuals who are the kind of extreme examples of using their artisanal talents, their abilities to leapfrog the social order. And you find this in artists, but also humanist scholars like Poggio Bracciolini. And I think, therefore, it's difficult to look at the Renaissance figure of the genius without seeing it as part of this wider social question of how do we account for these changing times, but not change too much. And so the genius is simultaneously a kind of liberatory figure, someone who can transcend the boundaries of their birth, but also a kind of reactionary figure, a way of saying this person can do this, but you can't. It's a special chosen few who are able to socially transcend rather than something anyone can do. Although that notion is something that ultimately, in some of the strains of self-making, comes to shift towards a more democratic model, for example, in America.
Right. And before we get to that, there was in the European aristocratic model, as you put it, that you chronicle what you refer to as the disenchantment of custom, that there was this profound disruption of the visual order of the cosmos, starting with something as mundane as the kind of clothes that people were allowed to wear, depending on their social status. I wonder if you can unpack this notion and why was that so instrumental and revolutionary during the Enlightenment project?
So during the European Enlightenment, one of the many kind of strains of thought that comes to the forefront is what I call, as you say, the disenchantment of custom, the just disenchantment of circumstance. The idea, basically, that the social imaginary is not something given by God or ordained by God. It isn't a system with a kind of inherent meaning, but it's kind of arbitrary or random. Why we do this rather than that, why certain things are associated with certain social stations. The French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, for example, takes aim at sumptuary laws, these ideas that certain members of the nobility could only wear certain fabrics, such as ermine, relative to their station. Although, interestingly, sumptuary laws were in fact very rarely enforced, and only kind of themselves were reflective of anxieties around the moneyed middle class being able to afford things traditionally associated with the aristocracy. So it's all the story of kind of social change as well as being a story of philosophical change. But increasingly throughout the Enlightenment, we find an increased focus on the individual reason, individual emotion, individual power of becoming one's own authority rather than accepting custom or external authority as normative. Montaigne, for example, constantly uses the metaphor of nakedness in his work to quite a comical degree, always saying, I wish I were naked. I wish you could see me naked. Wouldn't it be funny if I were naked right now? It's actually a little bit weird if you keep reading it. But assuming that there wasn't something else going on there, it seems that his rhetorical move here is to suggest that the true, authentic, real self is outside of and separate from society. And society is something you put on to occlude the reality of who you are. And this idea is the kind of precursor of later and modern notions of authenticity, that there is a sort of truth about ourselves that society is always at odds with.
So it seems that this rejection of custom, the suspicion of tradition, where circumstances of birth don't matter, and was a setup, as you're saying, for this binary opposition between self and society in a way that, as you're saying, this beginning of the inward turn to pursue our authentic selves, especially as you note in the book when Rousseau comes on the scene, right, with his original state of nature, that seemed like it broke the sacred link between nature and the social order.
Absolutely. There is a sense that the social order is purely, at best, arbitrary and random, and at worst, a source of oppression, as we see in a Rousseau. Something that's really interesting during this time is the proliferation of the genre of travelers' tales, which are fictionalized accounts either of Europeans who travel to what would have been known then as the New World or the Far East, or travelers from those places coming to Europe, where the purpose of the story was basically to say, people over there do things like this, and they think it's weird that we do things like that. And maybe it is, it is weird, it is random, it is arbitrary. It's silly that we have a silly man in a funny hat who says that we can turn wine and bread into the blood and body of God. Like, that's so ridiculous. And the humor in it comes from this destabilizing of society as something that has real weight beyond occluding our true nature.
Yeah, and what is shocking, as I said in the beginning, is this kind of transvaluation that's taking place, where our desires are becoming the guiding force for truth and our measure of our worth and our identity. And as I mentioned, it's completely orthogonal to the tenets of Buddhism, that the root of our suffering is egocentric desires. And your historical expose really shows that there was this dramatic shift to celebrating our wants and our desires, that in fact our real purpose was, as you say, to desire what we want. And but here's where I have a difficulty, is that it seems like there's a conundrum that not everyone can be special or a genius or a celebrity, and that self-making seems to require a certain oppression or subjugation of the masses, and that the elite self-made man and women also doesn't have to play by the rules, right? Or conventions of society. There's almost like this drive to shock or step outside the bounds, flaunt one's transgressions in order to set oneself apart. How did that kind of play out in different times?
Absolutely. The implicit question of self-making is, who gets to be a self-maker, and how do you know you're one of the special chosen few? And one of the answers that we find as early as, the Enlightenment, but really continues into the present day, is a combination of originality and transgression, that the true self-maker is above society's rules. Often these have to do with sexual prohibitions or bourgeois notions of sexuality. But we can see in, for example, the writings of the Marquis de Sade, a notorious libertine in the original sense, as well as someone who was very credibly accused, and people forget this, of quite a lot of sexual assault and rape. This people often think, and this is one of my great bugbears, that he was in prison for his writings. This was most of his imprisonments were not for his writings. But there is this kind of sense that the true original, the powerful self-maker, knows that morality too, sexual morality in particular, but really any morality, is a kind of sham to be mocked or overcome. Another sort of figure in this vein we find is the figure of Rameau's nephew in the novella by the same name by Denis Diderot, a less obviously murderous example than the characters we find in de Sade's fiction, but still someone who basically boasts about wanting to be a kind of genius of evil, wanting to fool others for social gain and taking pleasure in the ability to fool others. We find this figure of the trickster who uses his society's rules against itself. Also in the character of Vivian Grey in the novel by Benjamin Disraeli in Regency England, written under a pseudonym. And we find it, today as well in these countercultural figures like Ozzy Osbourne biting the head off a bat. Somehow transgression is a way of showing that you are better than merely society, and that your authentic you-ness is more valuable than the you-ness, the selfhood of people who are merely content to sheep-like play by the rules of society.
Yeah. Well, there seemed to be a shift too, from the Renaissance with geniuses who at least produced something, right? I mean, they were painting, they were making inventions, and as time went on in Regency England, what is this fashioning, refashioning, or monetizing of one's public image? What is that about?
So I think we find in the figure of Beau Brummel, who I believe you're referring to here, a really interesting example of, as you say, someone who's just famous for being famous, where the product of a genius is they themselves, or their own public persona. So Beau Brummel, born kind of upper middle class to upper middle class, has a modest inheritance, not that much by today's standards. Grandfather ran a boarding house, which may or may not have been a bordello, but he has this indefinable qualities, sort of known as bon ton. It's translated as good manners, but really it means style, flair, or to use another French term, je ne sais quoi. And in as part of this kind of elegance, he ends up meeting the Prince of Wales, the Prince Regent, soon to be George IV, at probably when he is at Eton. Again, story of social mobility. The fact that he is a middle class person who is able to go to this very, very posh boarding school, normally for members of the aristocracy, complicates this narrative a little bit. But through his friendship with the Prince of Wales and his incredible sartorial style, he basically becomes the unofficial stylist of the prince, Prinny, as he was known to his friends, who was rather ungainly and unfashionable and prone to overdressing. And Beau Brummel becomes an overnight celebrity. Everybody wants to dress like him. Everybody wants to be him. Everyone's afraid of his cutting wit. He famously will just mock someone, even his quote unquote social betters, if they're dressed improperly or not behaving properly. And he gets so famous that immediately tailors start basically making free stuff for him or giving him things on credit they know he'll never repay, because as soon as he wears something, everybody else wears it. He's a walking advertisement. At one point, he gets into wearing a beaver hat, and immediately the population of beavers in North America plummets because everybody wants a beaver hat. And and ultimately, he becomes, and this causes a real strain on his relationship with the Prince Regent, more famous and admired than the prince. There's a sort of satirical poem of the time which talks about the someone going to a tailor and saying, what is the Prince Regent wearing? What is Beau Brummel wearing? Which should I pick? And it's Brummel's pick that wears out, Brummel's pick of fabric. And ultimately, this leads to this big rupture in their friendship. And well, Brummel dies penniless with syphilis because he had a lot of gambling debt. But other than that, his ascendancy does represent the triumph of this kind of new breed of public opinion for some quality, some style, some grace, some it, to use a later term, over the traditional markings of hereditary aristocracy. And indeed, the Prince Regent was quoted as saying, I don't care for the mob. He's not afraid of what the mob thinks, but I do care for the dandies. He's afraid. He knows that this new celebrity culture will ultimately maybe not be the death of the monarchy, but maybe the death knell of its real relevance.
So as self-creation then migrates to America, it takes on a different character, right, from the European aristocratic forms of self-making. It's less about genius or presenting oneself as one, to, as you characterize, the more democratic self-creation, namely through hard work and personal effort, bootstrapping, and where wealth seems to be a measure of one's moral worth and superiority. You highlight Frederick Douglass as one of the key icons for this democratic narrative.
There's sort of a two-step process in America. And the first kind of wave of this, the Douglass model, deeply rooted in classical liberalism, is a kind of political idealism. It's the idea that we are governing ourselves as this new nation. And how can we be expected to govern ourselves politically if we cannot personally govern ourselves? And so hard work, industry, self-governance, self-cultivation are valorized as a kind of part of a wider virtue ethics system, and which results ideally, and this is something Frederick Douglass kind of talks about repeatedly in his lecture on the self-made man, the promise that America is a place where, regardless of who your father is, regardless of where or how you were born, particularly striking given that Douglass was born into chattel slavery, that America was a place where you could become a gentleman. And interestingly, given our conversation earlier about bastards and paternity, a lot of the language he uses is that, in Europe, the sons of so-and-so and the sons of so-and-so are given high favor because of their father's rank. But here, we have the spiritual sons of Abraham Lincoln and Clay, and it's because people must prove themselves. Sonship is this kind of non-biological lineage, but a lineage of hard work and legacy and effort. And so far, so good. But unfortunately, so early on, or early on in America, this is The self-made man is not a multi-billionaire. He's not a captive industry. He is Abraham Lincoln. He is Frederick Douglass. He is virtuous, industrious, and comes from nothing to have a solidly middle-class, comfortable life, but no further. But then, just a few generations later, by the time of the post-war, post-Civil War era, particularly in what is now known as the Gilded Age, this era of incredible industry and wealth inequality, the definition of self-making changes, and the self-made man becomes not the virtuous statesman, but the extremely wealthy entrepreneur making billions. The model of the self-made man goes from the virtuous statesman to the captain of industry, the robber baron, the Andrew Carnegie, the person who makes money for money's sake. And money, and only money, becomes the measure of the proof of hard work and moral superiority.
Yeah, so these Gilded Age robber barons then were using this social philosophy to self-justify their enormous wealth on the one hand, and it was simply a moral failing if you were poor. Or, I picked up this term from Derek Beres, who was a co-author of a new book called Conspirituality the other day. I interviewed him too. Soft eugenics. I thought that was a really interesting term because it seems like we see this now even in the positive psychology and happiness literature, that the notion that all it takes is thinking positively or having more grit, and that circumstances, according to them, only account for 10% of your happiness, well-being, success, whereas 50% is hereditary and 40% is within one's agency. But I want to go back to this idea of money as divine energy. It reminds me of this book, this tome, this magnum opus that I'm reading now by Eugene McCarraher, The Enchantment of Mammon. Yeah, where he argues we've never been disenchanted, that capitalism became our modern religion of enchantment. And you write something quite similar. If you don't mind, I'll read the quote. The pursuit of money in the capitalist system was a kind of holy act, a form of self-expression by which those who hoped to claim the title of nature's fittest could most completely express their humanity. What it means to be human, in other words, was to hustle. I thought, oh my God, that really captures it. And so this inward turn that was happening and during the Gilded Age is still alive and well, right? I mean, this seems like a profound shift in how we came to see ourselves. And as you point out in the book, this idea of turning inward to tap our divine potential. It also signified that we were already godlike. You just needed to learn how to tap into that potential, as you put it. You just needed to learn how to hack into it. And that potential seemed to always be tied to money and financial success. So, I know I'm going on a bit here, but this reminds me a bit about how mindfulness was also co-opted and instrumentalized and commercialized. I mean, it's it's like a little knowledge is a dangerous thing in a way. I'm thinking here, going back to what we said earlier, the Christian dictum that the kingdom of God is within you. In some ways, this turning inward is consonant in a way with the Christian mystical impulse. But the practice is more to do with self-emptying than self-making. And so how did this turning inward move get corrupted or distorted? I mean, that's the kind of a question that, because it's almost like they're half right. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. What's really interesting about the Gilded Age is that on the one hand, you have this sort of valorization of hard work, but you also see the rise of this self-help tradition called New Thought, which is about rooted in the idea that positive thinking, that focusing on picture in your mind's eye of success will cause the universe to kind of bend to your will, that you'll be able to harness the energies of the universe in order to attain wealth. And originally New Thought starts in the 1860s in New Hampshire as just a faith healing movement, just about getting well. But in the Gilded Age, it proliferates and becomes popular as a sort of wealth movement, a guide to success. So book after book after book, James Allen, William Walker Atkinson, all publishing books on how to basically manifest your way into riches. And so the idea at the time knew of natural selection, social Darwinism, evolution itself, the discovery, Charles Darwin's Evolution of Species itself being quite new. I knew scientific and pseudoscientific ideas about electricity, all kind of ideas of magnetism as well, all fused together in this sort of pseudo-scientific self-help industry, that there's a current, an energy in the universe, and that you can harness it. And if you learn how to harness it, if you learn how to like look into yourself, you can make it do your will, and you can get the material rewards that you want, and you can be at the top of the evolutionary heap. And this goes hand in hand with kind of rhetoric about cutting or not granting wider social services, or not otherwise addressing in material ways wealth inequality, because, you know, evolution means that the survival of the fittest, and you simply have to either let the poor die in order to let humanity flourish, or you have to let the poor die because helping the poor would be stopping them from practicing their own positive thinking and strengthening their own muscles. There's a real conviction that nobody is poor or even sick unless deep down that's what they want. As one of these self-help manifestos of New Thought puts it, life is a banquet and none is shut out from the feast. You're only shut out if you just don't want it badly enough.
Right. You make a really cogent point, too, that these developments, I'm going to quote you on this one, is what we might today call self-actualization, the idea that becoming our truest, best, and most successful selves is not only desirable, but in fact, the fulfillment of our purpose on this planet. And the reason I bring that up now is that it seems like this was a time when a fertile ground or the soil for a privatized spirituality, self-help movement was being planted, beginning to germinate. Would you say?
I think that the way that I would frame it is that ultimately, and this is true of both the aristocratic and democratic models, there is no sense of a kind of transcendent moral authority outside the self. And so the purpose of the self is like, we are the arbiters of values, we are the creators of meaning, kind of become our own god, so to speak. And so our personal happiness, or our personal perception of happiness, which is not really the same thing, I would argue, is kind of the closest thing to authority we have. And so we are not sort of looking within to examine ourselves, to compare ourselves to a notion of higher purpose. We think it is up to us to make and dictate that purpose. I think this is why Nietzsche is so important in the story. His vision both of the transvaluation of values, of the kind of overthrowing of what he sees as this Judeo-Christian false slave morality, as well as his vision of the Übermensch, the person who sees the meaninglessness of the world and embraces it by kind of becoming a maker of meaning himself. This is ultimately, I think, the implicit metaphysic at the heart of both of these narratives. Now, I don't think it's true universally. I actually think that the Frederick Douglass model is sort of deeply rooted in both like Aristotelian virtue ethics and in a quite Christian vision of liberalism, that this is a kind of human dignity and human moral self-governance. But as soon as money gets involved, I think you're absolutely right that we do see this original vision get corrupted by a call to personal gratification.
And with Nietzsche, it seems like self-expression, it becomes obligatory in a way. I mean, when I think about what you're saying, the caricature-like figures like Tony Robbins and Donald Trump, they seem to be maybe models of what you're saying, that truth and desire are indistinguishable at this point.
Absolutely, especially Donald Trump, whose personal family pastor was, of course, Norman Vincent Peale, one of the most famous practitioners in the 20th century of New Thought. His Power of Positive Thinking was a massive bestseller in the 1950s and was basically a synthesis of his own Christianity with really like classic, original New Thought exhortations to picturize, prayerize, and actualize. And Trump has certainly spoken about Peale's influence on him publicly. But I think that this idea that reality is just what you make it, reality is what you want it to be, reality is the perceptions that you shape of other people. All of this is really downstream of this spiritual sense that human beings are the only meaning makers, but that therefore the field of human perception is the field of reality shaping. That if you can just alter people's perceptions of you, you aren't lying. you're changing reality. You're doing magic, essentially. And that's something you see as early as the Renaissance in, Baldassare Castiglione's exhortation that courtiers should have sprezzatura. They should make things look effortless, even if they aren't, all the way to the amoral Vivian Grey and Benjamin Disraeli's satirical dandy novel, the same name. We see this in Rameau's Nephew. We see by Diderot. And we see this all the way in Donald Trump. Reality is what you make it. It's a theme that happens over and over again, that if you can convince people of something, you've basically won.
Yeah, I also enjoyed when you got into talking about, writing about TV and just how important that shift was. And it seems that our current post-truth world of alternative facts was germinating as far back as the early 60s. As you noted, the historian Daniel Boorstin was quite prescient in his critique of television and its effects on American culture. So here we are. I mean, even as far back as the 60s and 70s, we were already fermenting that self-making was the source of truth and setting the stage for a culture of unreality and mass delusion. Did you want to say something about this TV series? It reminds me, it seems like it was the first reality TV docu-follow series, The American Family.
An American Family, absolutely. I think a lot of people will think of The Real World in the 90s as the first reality TV show, but it's actually a generation prior. This sort of docudrama that's meant to be a documentary series, An American Family, of a very sort of clean-cut, wealthy California all-American family are going to lay bare their lives to the cameras. And basically what follows is a giant media firestorm. The sort of patriarch and matriarch's marriage dissolves basically on television. They decide to divorce during the run of the show. Their son Lance, who is out and gay, is friends with a great admirer of Andy Warhol, and kind of moves to New York to get into this factory scene of the time. And people are appalled. Why are people agreeing to be on TV? Why are these people seeking fame? It's this huge sort of scandal of the time. And yet everybody is riveted. And they're riveted by, I think, not just the fact that these are some crazy people who are willing to do this thing, but that actually they are representatives of a time. The producers of the show insist that, they were one of very many families who auditioned to be on. Because in kind of creating this identity for themselves, the Pat Loud, the matriarch of the family, recalls sort of wanting to become like the West Coast Kennedys. They think, we're going to be on TV and we're going to present this image to the world. It all goes wrong. And yet in going wrong, kind of captures something that is happening in the 60s and 70s and in post-war America, particularly with the rise of television, is that people are starting to think of themselves as, if not celebrities, then potential celebrities. The narratives of their lives, the dramas of their lives exist in some measure for public consumption. The awareness that cameras are getting smaller and smaller and more personal and accessible also means that the individual person is closer and closer to stardom.
Yeah, this seems to be a precursor to the confessional daytime TV.
Absolutely.
So this moral imperative to become the best version of ourselves through technology, which is quite prevalent now, which seems to be conveniently tied to capital accumulation. This seems to be psychologically exhausting, but on the other hand, it seems to also be a way of atrophying our civic and political lives. Do you see that happening?
Absolutely. I think this idea that we are what we want, we are our desires, our identity has to do with our affinities and our voluntary associations, means that we are inclined, as Montaigne and Rousseau did, or even more so, to see society as our enemy. And in so doing, to see our neighbors as our enemy. That society, this thing that keeps us together, this entity that gives us the stories, the language, the shared understanding with which we process our desires or sense of selves, we can only see as a source of as something from which we wish to be liberated. And I worry about what that means for our civic associations, for our political associations, even for friendship, a political and social relationship that kind of makes self-making impossible by virtue of the fact that we are vulnerable to one another. And I don't think the gospel of self-actualization, of being our best self, has much room for the kind of ambiguities and vulnerabilities that real relationships have.
Yeah, we hear a lot about the mental health crisis today, the loneliness epidemic issue that's being talked about. And you wrote a really interesting op ed last year for the New York Times, the problem with letting therapy speak, invade everything. And I guess I'd like to step back from this historical evolution of self making. You've kind of answered it already, but you've provided an amazing account of how we got to where we are today. So I'd like to ask you, what's the price we've had to pay with this obsession, this moral imperative self-making?
I think you've pointed right at it. The mental health epidemic, the loneliness epidemic, worsened by the pandemic and the kind of isolation we had with it. Political, not just polarization, but a kind of real sense of fracture, that people are living in different realities from one another. And I'm afraid I'm a bit of a pessimist. I don't know how we reverse some of this damage. I don't know how we get back. I think that among younger people, anecdotally, many are aware of the cost of living one's life entirely online, or of the kind of loneliness and alienation that come from constantly needing to kind of bolster one's narrative of oneself, or experiencing life as a kind of source to be mined for content, which is bolstering someone's kind of unreal avatar, either for social capital, or in the case of influencers, actual monetary capital. But I do think that we will see some measure of a backlash against this. As generations who have grown up online, perhaps even with their baby pictures, the content for their parents' social media profiles. But whether that will be significant enough to outweigh the normalization of a kind of society where we are almost 90% of us have smartphones, where many of us sort of can't get through the world, whether it's using public transport or looking at a menu in a restaurant without smartphones, whether that tide can ever be turned. And that's something that I doubt, or at least I think that the only people who can avoid the personal branding are those fortunate enough, wealthy enough, successful enough to not be reliant on the attention economy at all.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is, how do we not throw the baby out with the bathwater as well? I mean, it seems like the ideal of self-cultivation and self-betterment has liberatory potential, but it seems like the impulse, or it's hard to safeguard that against capitalist exploitation. And one of the other wonderful, quite lengthy essays you wrote recently in The Plow, Spiritual Realism in a Divided America. One of the key points you make in that article is that we've lost sight of our need for finding common ground, or a communal sensibility, a need for shared meaning. And given this cultural void and vacuum, it seems that, could this explain the allure of these fringe wellness communities and even cults? And I remember seeing you on a Netflix series called Cult a while back. But do you think this is why people are gravitating to the New Age and intuitive religions, as you call them in your previous book?
Yes. Absolutely. Or rather, the way that I would frame it is, I think a wider decline in public trust in institutions, ecclesiastical, political, journalistic, scientific, and spiritual alike, mean that at least these kind of intuitional, what you might call woo or new age or what have you, uh, ways of thinking, where you are the only authority, at least you think, well, I know I'm not lying to myself. There's a sense that you can trust yourself more than you can trust anybody else. But at the same time, I think one of the things that happens with intuitionalism is it's a pretty lonely way of being. It's not a community. And I think that lonely people looking for meaning and purpose, as well as ritual and community, are extremely likely to gravitate toward people claiming either spiritual wisdom or an ability to foster community. And I think we can see the success of, for example, masculinity influencers, from Jordan Peterson to Andrew Tate, as examples of the hunger that people have for a kind of moral architecture, as well as for the community that goes with it.
Yeah, the parasocial relationships that are happening. Tara, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a delight to be on.
This is the Mindful Cranks podcast. I hope you like our new look and feel. And check out our webpage at www.mindfulcranks.com. And subscribe to the Cranks newsletter to learn about upcoming guests and other events. The Mindful Cranks is pretty much on every podcast platform. Please rate and review the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you are so inclined. That's it for now. I'll be back soon with another amazing guest. Thanks for listening.